This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm Jessica Morrison.
And I'm David Blaney.
2019 is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. A few years ago, the United Nations reported that of the 6,500 languages spoken around the world, about 40% are in danger of dying out. With us today to discuss the future of Australian Indigenous languages is Alan Dench, Professor of Linguistics and Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin University and author of several books on the topic of Aboriginal languages. Alan, what does it mean to preserve a language?
That's a good question. What does it mean to preserve a language? I think most people tend to think that preserving a language means keeping the language as it always was and always will be, pretty much used for all the things it was always used for. But think of some examples like, well, take Latin. We tend to think of Latin as a dead language, but Latin has been preserved and is still used as a spoken language in the Vatican, for example, but used for very specific purposes. So if we take that example and think, okay, languages are used in different contexts for different things by different people to achieve different ends, and they're very complex. So when you say preserve a language, you might think, well, I'll preserve this language or this bit of a language for these purposes, but a lot of it we won't necessarily keep.
Is it possible, though, to preserve them all? There's so many. There's, as we heard, 6,500 languages spoken around the world.
Probably not, no. I mean, not only can't we, I don't think, but should we? There are questions around whether that's even a good thing to be thinking about. I mean, languages are ultimately there for a reason. Speakers use languages to achieve particular ends. And the world has changed a lot. And we used to live in kind of small agricultural and hunter-gatherer societies where there were a few hundred people who were interacting with each other and they had their own language. Now we don't live like that so much anymore, at least in most of the world we don't. And so we're living in much larger organisations and communities with much broader reach. And it makes sense that our languages, I guess, have that broader reach and wider function.
What strategies are being used to preserve Australian Indigenous languages?
Well, I mean, first of all, I guess we recognise that Australia's already lost a lot of languages. So not only is Australia one of the hotspots for losing species, we're also a hotspot for losing language and culture as well, unfortunately. So we've lost a lot of the originally 250 or so Australian Aboriginal languages. And those that do remain, there's only a handful that are really being learned naturally and organically by children in those communities.
So we started with 250. How many do we have left?
Depends how you count and what you're counting. And of course, it also depends, if I take the Latin example again, how much of a language is there before you say it's gone or is still there, and those kinds of questions. So I'd say we're down below 100, certainly. Some would argue we're down below 10 if you're looking at languages that are being transmitted to the next generation in the way that kids normally learn languages. But having said that, and to come back to your earlier question, there are interventions. So people are intervening by deliberately teaching languages at school, in, say, kindergartens, and then adults are learning languages as well.
There's now Aussie hip-hop artists like Baker Boy, Electric Fields that are incorporating Indigenous language into their lyrics. Do you think that popular culture is going to be a powerful way to keep these languages alive? Talking just sort of Australian Indigenous language? Absolutely,
yeah. Yeah, I think languages ultimately are really a great badge of identity for their speakers. So by speaking a particular language, I mark myself out as a member of a community, and I make myself as a member of that and exclude other communities. So it makes sense then that if we want younger people to be learning a language, then the language has to mean something to their identity, has to fit in with their other markers of identity, has to be something that they can identify with. Okay, so certainly seeing language used in popular music is an obvious way of it connecting to people and to their interests.
So does the preservation of Indigenous languages play a broader role in reconciliation?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, again, it comes to that point of identity. I think that languages identify communities, and by recognising the languages, we're recognising those communities and putting them on an equal footing with all the other communities that we would recognise who have their own languages and have their own cultures. So a real step towards saying, yes, we understand that you speak a different language, that you have this very rich linguistic heritage that has been inherited over thousands of years, we're saying we think you're important and you've got something that's special.
You talked before about school children learning languages in kindergarten. Do you think that Australian school children should have the option to learn an Indigenous language as their second language, as opposed to perhaps Asian or European languages?
Yes, certainly. And many of them do, actually. So there are plenty of opportunities. It varies from area to area, from state to state, but lots of kids do have that opportunity.
Which states have been doing this the most?
The most, I can't tell you exactly the most, but there are language revival programs in Adelaide, for example. There's quite a bit in New South Wales where there are languages being used and being brought back in schools. And depending on the school you're in, across Western Australia, there are schools where Indigenous languages are being presented to kids as well.
We continue to see new land developments given Anglo names. We've had the newly established Cygnet Cove nearby, and the city of Coburn recently named a new suburb Treeby after early colonists, despite calls for an Indigenous name. So how important is it that our suburbs and landmarks...
Plus we had Elizabeth Key as well.
Exactly.
She's got quite a bit named after her already, dare I say.
How important is it that these places are given Indigenous names in terms of that making it more, not in popular culture, but, just more recognisable?
I think it's very important. I think the first point to make is that it's not as if these places don't already have names.
Very true.
It's very much the case that there are places across the Australian landscape that have a rich history of naming. And we often haven't recorded all of that necessarily, and some of the knowledge of it's been lost. But in most of the parts of the continent, people do remember the names of the old places. So why not use those names?
So it's a little bit like with the dual naming of Fremantle. That already had an Indigenous
Absolutely,
name.
Yeah,
We're just now recognising it.
Yes, that's right. But there are many suburbs across Perth that are named for the original Indigenous names, etc. So, well, I live in Curtin. That's an Aboriginal name. Karrinyup, the same name basically, but it's in two adjacent suburbs. Yokine is a local Mount Yokine, I guess. Yagain probably, or Yogain was the word for dingo, I suspect, and so it's named for probably lots of dingoes howling on the hill. I don't know for certain, but so there are quite a lot of names that we have. Balga is the
got a lot of towns as well, like Kojonup, for example.
Of course, yeah. So there's plenty of names we already have. There's no reason why we shouldn't continue to do that and extend it.
So maybe it's more around education or awareness, because I didn't know that those names, the well-known suburbs to me in Perth, actually have an Indigenous background, or that's the Indigenous word.
That's right. No, I think there's quite a lot that people don't recognise that these things are there. And as you say, I mean, I remember working at Onslow in the northwest, and there was the name of the place was Beadon Creek, Beadon. I thought I must have been an early European explorer, and then I eventually kind of learnt enough of the local language to realise that Beadon was the local word for quartz and white sands. So it was named after the white beaches that were nearby, the creek mouth. And it had been written down in something that looked like it was a Western name.
Wow. In terms of, obviously we mentioned at the introduction that this year is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Is there anything being done at a sort of higher national level to preserve and to continue to preserve Indigenous languages Australian Indigenous languages? Well,
there's certainly a heightened awareness this year, and that's true, I think, especially amongst Aboriginal communities, Indigenous communities around the country, who are doing things themselves. So they're doing a whole lot of celebrations around recognising their languages. They're taking the opportunity to apply for funding support to introduce language programs. And there's a wider recognition across government and education departments, etc., to promote the programs they're already engaged in. So I think there's been quite a raised level of interest because of this, and what we can hope is that momentum will continue.
What are some of the things happening in the Indigenous communities you mentioned? Like, what are some examples of what they're trying to do to preserve these languages, because they would be the keepers of the language?
Yeah. Okay. To give you an example, I guess I'm involved in. When I was an honours student way back in the late 70s, I I had my first experience of working on Australian Aboriginal language in Carnarvon, which happened to be the town I grew up in as well. But I went back with my teacher who'd just finished a PhD. And while he was working on a number of other languages, he suggested to me that I speak with some speakers of Ingara, which is the language of Carnarvon. So I collected some material in Ingara at the time, and over the next 3 or 4 years, I was doing work on other languages, collected more Ingara, wrote up a grammar and a short word list. Now, by that time, the community was already losing the language, so there were only a handful of speakers left that we thought about.
So that's
at that
only
time.
how long a time period are we talking there?
Oh, well, that was in the mid-80s by then.
Wow.
So that's, I don't know, you can do the math.
But that's not very long, really, is it?
No. So that was kind of almost gone then, I guess. Well, my colleague Peter, who's at the University of London, was contacted by the community saying, because he'd been in touch with them, and they said, well, could you come back and make a dictionary for us? So he's retired, he's come back to Australia for different periods of time. And he and I are working now on putting together a dictionary of Ingara to go with the grammar that I wrote some years ago. And the community are very keen, and Peter's been in Carnarvon running workshops with the local community, asking how would they like this presented? What kind of form of dictionary would best suit them for their needs, and so on. So these are the kinds of things that are happening. That, I think, was a grassroots thing that had probably been there thinking about it for some years, but this International Year of Indigenous Languages gave them the impetus to say, let's get on and do something now.
And that's amazing that that's happening in that community. Is it widespread, though, around communities around Australia? Yeah, I think
a lot of communities are doing the same sorts of things. So they're doing it in different ways. They're contacting different people. Very much a grassroots thing, I think, but there's also some, assistance from funding bodies to be working on this.
But do you think it has to be grassroots, really, for it to be able to take off?
Ultimately, if you want to preserve a language, then it has to come from the speakers themselves. There's nothing that I can do as a linguist that says, here's the materials, bang, 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 it's all there. If there's not the drive from the community to do something, and not the direction from the community about what they think is going to best work for them, then really it's not going to work. It really has to have that motivation from the community as speakers themselves.
So other than names of flora and fauna, there aren't all that many Indigenous words that have made its way into everyday vocabulary. So we've got billabong, I guess, for example. How can we encourage broader use of Indigenous languages among the whole community?
I think actually I'd answer that with the point you made earlier, which was that education about what we already have isn't a bad start. Our local language, Noongar, has given more words to the English language than any other Aboriginal language other than the Sydney language.
Really?
Well, if you think about it. So think about all of the animals and plants that we have around here that we recognise. There's a jarrah tree, a carry tree, our local state animal emblem, the numbat, is a Noongar word, numbait. We have a jurich, we have a whole range of things, quendas. I don't know, you know what a quenda is, right? Little bandicoots. Or kundi, quenda, depending on the dialect.
Okay.
So we have lots of local words for fauna and flora that are borrowed directly from Noongar. Chewit trees, if you don't know those, right? So all kinds of things. And so we're not necessarily aware that we already have a rich legacy of the local languages in the English that we speak in Western Australia. So maybe the first step in terms of this is recognising that, celebrating that, and maybe saying, well, what other words can we introduce? So instead of talking about grass trees, we can talk about balgas. And we have that as the name of a suburb, right? So we've also got it. We can have that also as the way we talk about the kind of very common tree we find around town.
Where do you think that drive needs to come from? Or not drive, but how do we make that happen? How does that start, that awareness? Whose responsibility is it?
I guess it's everyone's responsibility. I don't think we want to say it's the responsibility of the Aboriginal community alone. It shouldn't be. I mean, why should it be their responsibility to overcome the lack of our understanding and awareness? Really, it's our business and our responsibility to do that. So it can start through education. It can start through telling kids that these things that you use every day are Noongar words.
Well, look, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Alan, for coming in and sharing your expert knowledge on this very interesting topic. We appreciate it.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about today's topic, please get in touch by following the links in our show notes. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye for now. Bye. Bye for now.
It works.